Okay, we are starting the third and thirdly final day of the conference. I hope everyone's doing well and enjoyed the conference so far. And this final day is also packed with panels, and there is a reception to close the conference. But we are starting with our final plenary speaker, Professor Nata Duvvury, Professor of Gender and Women's Studies and Director of the Center for Global Women's Studies here at the University of Galway, School of Political Science and Sociology. And welcome, Professor Nata Duvvury is a development expert with research interests in gender, labor markets and welfare state, gendered impacts of globalization, economic costs of gender-based violence, civil society and global governance, and also in social mobilization. She has done extensive work on violence against women, and in particular, establishing the economic and social consequences of violence for women, families, communities, and society at large. She is actively involved in the Anti-Racism Committee in the office of the VP EDI at the University of Galway, and recently completed research titled Intersectional Discrimination Index, Understanding Student Experience of Intersectional Discrimination at the University of Galway. Her talk today is titled Violence Against Women, Multi-Headed Hydra. So very pleased to have you here, Professor Duvvury, and the floor is yours.
So good morning. It is a privilege to be with you at the Interdisciplinary Social Sciences Conference on Bridging Boundaries. I will be discussing an issue that is familiar to all of us, an issue that is a serious concern, and an issue that seems intractable. We've had decades of work on violence against women, and it still seems intractable. I hope I can provide a new perspective, reviving an old metaphor that can hopefully give us a deeper understanding of violence. As an aside, I must confess, I did not know that this summer we would see a revival of Greek myths and legends. As you know, the film Odyssey has just come out, and there's suddenly a resurgence of interest in the Greeks and the Greek mythology. I will also discuss what response we can consider that would address some of the systemic dynamics that fuel violence. I will begin this talk with first considering some of the key definitions of violence against women and the level of knowledge that we have about this phenomenon. What is some of the empirical data? I will then move to discuss the metaphor of the Hydra and then end the discussion with how to slay the Hydra. So, definitions. UN Human Rights Commission has defined violence against women as a manifestation of historically unequal power relations between men and women, which have led to domination over and discrimination against women by men and to the prevention of the full advancement of women. Building on this definition, the UN defines in its very famous 1993 Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, that violence against women is any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, and mental harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts as coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. This definition is important because it makes a very critical clarification that violence can occur in public or private life, thus demanding accountability from public bodies to prevent forms of violence that occur within the home or other private spheres, institutional spheres, and in public sphere. I must clarify that gender-based violence or violence that is rooted in gender norms and unequal power balance based on gender affects not only women and girls, but also is experienced by men and boys, transgender people, people with disabilities, ethnic minorities, and other marginalized people. Much of what I discussed today is applicable to this broader phenomenon of gender-based violence. However, the focus on violence against women is delivered as women, and including girls, disproportionately experience gender-based violence. There has been a huge debate that whenever we talk about violence against women, the immediate question is, well, what about men? And we must recognize what about men is critical. Women and girls, men and boys do experience gender-based violence. Violence is based on the gender differences and the unequal gender power relations. But politically, it is important to keep a focus on violence against women because women and girls disproportionately experience violence. It's an old point, but it's a point that we have to keep repeating. Now, what are some of the evidence that we have on violence against women? So first, as this conference is happening in Ireland, it is important to note that in the first 6 months of this year, 8 women have been murdered by someone known to them, equivalent to the entire number in the last year, in 2025. So in the first 6 months, we already have 8 women who have been killed. Every month, at least one woman has been killed, coming from different parts of the world, as well as Ireland. Violence against women is not confined to one particular culture, race, nationality, age, or class. Again, old point, but we have to keep repeating it. So what we see is the most recent data from WHO suggests that 840 million women have experienced physical and or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence in their lifetime. So that is nearly 1 billion women. So that is a significant portion of the global population experiences this on a daily or at least once in their lifetime. And there is also important to notice that 263 million women experienced, in addition to intimate partner violence, non-partner sexual violence from the age of 50. And physical and sexual intimate partner violence is not just something that happens once in your lifetime, but it's often something that is repeated daily or frequently. And we see that 11% of women say that they've experienced it in the last 12 months. And that is 316 million women. This just shows you the global scale of this phenomenon. But it is not only sexual intimate partner violence, but it is also technology facilitated violence, which is a new form of violence, which has been growing systematically over the last 3 decades. The data from UN Women in its most recent fact sheet, that is in November 2025, they cited that 1 in 10 women in the European Union report having experienced cyber harassment since the age of 15. And this included receiving unwanted and or offensive sexually explicit emails or SMS messages, offensive or inappropriate advances on social networking sites. In the Arab states, a regional study found 60% of women internet users in the region had been exposed to online violence. And in Uganda and in Western Balkans and Eastern Europe, more than half of the women present online reported experiencing violence. In Uganda, again, about half in 2021 reported experiencing online violence. The rates of cyber violence is in fact even higher than intimate partner and sexual violence. That we should not forget. What we thought that we had begun to address has now morphed into this new form, and it's more virulent. It is more intense. And that is important to keep in mind. But there are other forms of violence that are important also to consider. As I said, femicide, and around 140 women and girls are killed every day by an intimate partner or another family member. That is, one woman or girl is killed every 10 minutes, every day, day in and day out, every year. We have to keep repeating these statistics because this only tells us how significant and dangerous is this phenomenon of violence against women. And we also know that violence against women includes human trafficking, where women and girls are often the biggest share of detected victims of trafficking. Female genital mutilation, cultural practice that still continues, and about 4 million girls undergo FGM, and over 2 million are under the age of 5. And another important cultural practice is child marriage, which is still continuing. We had the SDGs to say that we would reduce the rate of child marriage, and it is nowhere in sight to being achieved. And 1 in 5 young women aged 20 to 24 are married before the age of 18. It's not only just cultural practices, but all of this then gets epitomized in the violence that women face in public life. So across 5 regions, 82% of women parliamentarians reported having experienced some form of psychological violence while serving their term. A global survey revealed that 73% of women journalists have experienced online violence. So we think of women's empowerment is that we come out into public life, that we work, that we have professions, that we have careers. And our careers and our professions demand that we engage with the public space, and it requires that we engage with the digital media. And these have become weapons to further suppress or oppress women. And we also see that violence is related to conflict, humanitarian crisis, and climate change. I know these are all well-known facts, but I wanted to start by showing how pervasive, how dominant, and how serious violence against women is, and that we need to keep reminding ourselves. That is my point. But despite this level of knowledge that we have, we still do not have actually global prevalence data on some very key forms of violence, such as economic violence or psychological, emotional violence. There is no global prevalence data, rigorous prevalence data that we can say 1/3 of women experience. And this is because these are the forms of violence that are much more hidden, that are seen as they're not so harmful. I mean, you're not being beaten back in blue, so there's no problem with this. And this is the other thing that we have a sense of. There's a hierarchy of the types and forms of violence that we consider some as serious and others as part of daily life. Now, I want to turn and discuss the issue of violence as a multi-identified type. We often speak about violence against women as though it were a singular phenomenon, a discrete social problem to be measured, legislated against, or prevented through targeted interventions. But violence against women, as I've shown you, is not singular. We see from the data that violence is expressed in myriad types and forms, from physical to sexual to emotional to economic to coercion, across multiple locations. That's the other important thing to remember, ranging from intimate relationships to family, to workplace, to school, to public spaces, and to the internet. It mutates, it adapts, it regenerates across contexts and generations. To understand its persistence, we need a different metaphor, one that captures its interconnected, systemic, and evolving nature. We often talk about violence as multi-sectoral. That doesn't actually capture the dynamics of violence. You can have it across different sectors, but then the sectors can be separate, right? There's no the interconnection between sectors. So I think the Hydra is a very important metaphor to use to characterize violence against women. Now, in Greek mythology, the Hydra was a serpent-like monster whose heads multiplied when severed. Destroying one head without confronting the body that sustained it only reproduced the threat in another form. Sounds familiar, right? More importantly, the Hydra represents the underbelly of the society. It is not the usual monster guarding some secret treasure or kingdom. The Lernaean Hydra lived in the marshes around Lake Lerna, an ancient site regarded by the Greeks as mysterious and sacred. Lake Lerna was believed to contain one of the entrances to the underworld and was associated with ancient springs, death, rebirth, and chthonic powers. The Hydra did not guard a treasure, unlike other mythical creatures. It instead made the surrounding landscape uninhabitable. Its poisonous breath and blood killed humans. It terrorized nearby communities. It rendered fertile land inaccessible. In this sense, it guarded a dangerous threshold, the liminal space between civilization and the wild, between life and death. Because Hydra is rooted in the swamp at Lerna, a place associated with hidden depths and regeneration, it can be read symbolically as guarding the source from which destructive forces continually emerge. And that is the thing with violence against women. It's a destructive force that continuously emerges. Rather than standing watch over a treasure, it protects its capacity for regeneration and renewal. This metaphor is profoundly relevant to our global struggle against gender-based violence. For decades, feminist movements and policymakers have fought critical battles, criminalizing domestic violence, expanding shelters, prosecuting sexual assault, recognizing marital rape, addressing trafficking, and more recently confronting online abuse and technology-facilitated violence. These victories matter deeply. They have saved lives, transformed norms, and expanded the language of rights and justice. And yet the Hydra persists. As one form of violence becomes visible and contested, another emerges and or intensifies. Legal reforms coexist with rising backlash. Digital connectivity creates new terrains of misogyny and surveillance. Economic crises deepen women's dependency and exposure to abuse. Conflict and displacement normalize extreme forms of gender violence. Climate disasters increase the risk of exploitation. The Hydra changes shape because violence against women is not merely a collection of individual acts. We tend to focus on the individual acts, but it is more than that. It is an ecosystem of power. Its heads are intimate violence, sexual violence, economic violence, political violence, structural violence, digital violence. But the body that nourishes them, these different heads, is rooted in unequal power relations. It's patriarchy intertwined with racism, caste hierarchies, colonial legacies, militarization, economic inequality, and institutional impunity. That is why fragmented solutions usually fall short. A criminal justice response without economic justice leaves dependency intact. Education without safety infrastructure leaves girls vulnerable. And this is a major issue that we are constantly confronting now within our universities and within our schools. Laws without enforcement reproduce impunity. We struggle to get the laws on the books of so many countries. Nearly 60 to 80 countries have laws against violence against women, but there is no enforcement. It hasn't translated into a political will to root out this problem. Digital inclusion without accountability creates new spaces of harm. So the Hydra teaches us that violence is interconnected across scales, from home to street, refugee camp to cyberspace, from marketplace to the parliament, from everyday misogyny to femicide. And importantly, it reveals that violence is not exceptional. It is embedded in ordinary social and economic arrangements. It highlights that there is no hierarchy of forms and types of violence. This framing also compels us to rethink measurement and knowledge production. Too often, our data systems isolate forms of violence into separate categories, sectors, and indicators. We count incidents, but to fail to capture continuums. We estimate costs without fully accounting for intergenerational trauma. In fact, there are almost zero studies, costing studies, which is my area of expertise, that actually have been able to capture intergenerational trauma. And we know that violence, in one sense, is a learned behavior. And if we cannot understand how the trauma goes across generations, we're not having a full understanding of the totality of the impact of violence on human civilization. There's also lost political participation, ecological displacement, or the erosion of democratic life, because violence against women is not just a private matter of women experiencing some bad behaviors, but it leads to, through various channels, it has an impact on democratic society itself, because women who experience violence are often less able to participate in political processes. And communities that have violence are probably less, more fragmented, more fragile, which leads again to a loss of democratic norms. The Hydra metaphor urges us toward intersectional, systems-based, and life course approaches to evidence generation. Women's rights advocates further note that the Hydra has evolved in response to changing political, technological, and economic realities. Digital misogyny, online stalking, image-based abuse, and technology-facilitated violence are now recognized as extensions of patriarchal control, than rather entirely new phenomena. Similarly, climate crisis, forced migration, and armed conflict intensify vulnerabilities and generate new expressions of violence against women. So there has to be a body that we need to figure out of how do we attack violence against women. So So these are some of the main points that I was trying to highlight. So how do we slay the Hydra? One of the issues that I think is that we have to move beyond the ecological framework. In social sciences, ecological framework has been something very foundational that has helped us in trying to, well, whatever the phenomenon is, trying to understand the factors that influence a particular phenomenon. But much of our responses to violence against women have been influenced by the ecological framework, which provides a critical understanding of the factors that fuel and perpetuate or protect from the risk of violence. It is a framework that has enabled us to consider the multitude of factors from the individual to household to community to societal level that shape the likelihood of experiencing violence. While recognizing the multiple levels, interventions designed to address the consequences or even prevent harm have tended to focus on individual factors, such as age, education, attitudes to gender, household status, individual behaviors, drinking and gambling. More complex models try to incorporate intersectional understanding or identity by incorporating race, ethnicity, migration, status, class, disability, etc. But then these are all still siloed factors that you consider. A danger of this approach is that it shifts the focus on tweaking interventions. So this community intervention here didn't work so well, so we have to tweak something about, do we have tied in with the intervention a way to address drinking? So tweaking interventions then systematically addressing the different axes of power, namely racism, economic inequality, colonialism, and patriarchy. And I raise this issue because the movement of advocates and activists on violence against women have this understanding, but they also tend to become so inward focused on this particular tweaking of an intervention is going to be the ultimate solution. And that there is this tension between how do you see patriarchy versus how do you see economic inequality. The demands of many movements on violence against women have been more focused on patriarchy as the foundation, with less emphasis on understanding of the role of economic inequality, societal economic inequality, not at the household level inequality between men and women, but societal inequality, and how that plays a role. So activists have emphasized that violence against women cannot be understood as a single issue. Feminist movements across regions have consistently pointed the ways domestic violence, sexual exploitation, state violence, all of these reinforce one another. The metaphor of the multi-headed hydra reflects activists' understanding. When one form of violence is challenged, another emerges, unless the underlying structures of inequality are transformed. So that we're all agreed on, that there has to be a transformation of the underlying structures of inequality. But which structure of inequality is where the body is getting fuel? Is it patriarchy? Is it colonialism? Is it racism? Or is it economic inequality? And so I would like to argue that a way to address the hydra of violence against women is an umbrella of interventions that together are grounded in intersectionality and with adequacy, autonomy, dignity, equality of opportunity, non-conditionality, universality, simplicity, and transparency. A literature review of interventions and interviews with Indigenous women by the Huronia Transition Homes in Ontario, Canada in 2026 underscored that material stability must be paired with structural change in how institutions understand violence, poverty, and disability. Women described thriving not as an individual experience success, but as access to safety, dignity, belonging, and stable resources. Adequate housing, food, transportation, culturally grounded support, trauma-informed care emerged as foundational for participation, healing, and leadership. They revealed a broader architecture of harm rooted in coercive control, institutional surveillance, and colonial continuities, gender disability, misrecognition, housing precarity, and fragmented services. Income insecurity was central, but it operated within these interlocking systems that shape women's safety, dignity, and economic security. An idea that has been experimented with across several low and middle income countries is the idea of unconditional cash transfers. Now you see where I'm going. The most famous of which is the Brazil Bolsa Family Scheme that included unconditional cash transfers to women below a certain income threshold, reaching nearly 26 million women in poor households. These programs, there's been, in fact, it's surprising that the level of interventions on some of these programs, the evidence is still fragmented. We don't have very systematic studies. But a couple of studies that have been done show that these programs, such as Brazil Bolsa Family, does have positive effect on women's employment, but particularly in the context where there is public provision of goods such as health and education. This giving income by itself doesn't necessarily improve the situation, but it is combined with the public provision of certain types of goods that you see that there is a significant impact. So Stanford Basic Income Lab has been following nearly 160 experiments around the world that are focused on universal basic income. Universal basic income has become a recent talking point. And this is what is the features of a universal basic income. It is universal. This is many of the previous programs. Problem is that they're still targeted. And there is something about it, and you're in social sciences, so you know the debate between universal and targeted. It's unconditional. There has been a lot of attempt to have conditional cash transfers that have some positive outcomes, but don't necessarily sustain those positive outcomes. So the focus has been on, we must look at unconditional. The third is that it is cash. It's a cash payment. It allows recipients to convert their benefits however they choose. It is individual. It is paid on an individual basis, not on a household level. And this is particularly important in low and middle income countries, where a lot of welfare programs tend to be focused on the household level. And it is periodic. It's not a one-time payment. It is a recurring payment rather than a one-time grant. Now, a transformative potential of basic income guarantee or universal basic income is that it delinks understanding of our worth depending on productive work. UBI offers an alternative route that acknowledges that all people contribute to society through some form of participation. There is a review by Catherine Hatcher at who has argued in 2019, who argued that UBI would compensate women for their unpaid labor and reject the notion that those who perform it do not contribute to society. It would recognize the value of and thereby bolster the wages of women of color, who are most often paid caregivers, as well as compensate women for their second shift. It could also open an avenue for men to consider reproductive labor as not being as an economic cost. Because there's that tension. We have paternity leave, but men don't take paternity leave. Because in our system, in our values, we have this overemphasis that the only contribution that is counted is what is so-called productive, but that the reproductive work is also an important contribution and is not, and that not performing reproductive labor is in fact an economic cost, not that performing it is an economic cost. This would liberate both men and women from societal standards which render feminized experiences as invisible and stigmatize their activities as less valuable. For me, that body that fuels violence against women, it's this particular tension of what is valuable, what's not valuable. What work do we recognize? What work do we not recognize? And universal basic income could empower men and women alike to pursue activities which suit them best. By undermining women's label as the deviant other and normalizing their experiences, this universal basic income can challenge the idea that men's life patterns are typical and thus do a good job undermining the patriarchal norms. Some reviews have shown that there is a potential of universal basic income, and we need more research to accept this, explore and establish robustly what is the potential. But it is that it doesn't build, it's not the end point. That the universal basic income idea is not an end point, but it fills a foundation, one rooted in a larger ecosystem of change. When income security is paired with respectful institutions, culturally grounded programming, coordinated services, and feminist trauma-informed practice, conditions for flourishing become possible. Meeting basic needs through predictable income strengthens safety and well-being. But realizing women's autonomy requires a system built on dignity rather than surveillance and support rather than conditionality. In this way, the economic floor created by universal basic income becomes the basis for broader reforms that allow women to not only survive, but to thrive. So what we need now is not incrementalism, but we need transformation. We need to explore some of these ideas with enthusiasm and passion, because we need to restructure our societies. The way it is going cannot continue, because if it continues, we will only have new heads, new tentacles about spreading through society. And I think this is why we must move from reactive responses to prevention, from siloed sectors to integrated systems, from survivor management to structural change, from symbolic commitments to redistributive justice. And that redistributive justice includes, most fundamentally, economic justice, which is the urgent call of today's societies given the level of economic inequality that we see in today's society. And that is a patriarchy. So I would urge my feminist friends to think more critically about the economic inequality that is shaping our society is as powerful as patriarchal norms, and that economic justice designed in a proper way can actually begin to dismantle patriarchal norms, and that hopefully we would be like Hercules, finally being able to slay the multi-headed hydra. Thank you.
Right for the first question.
I
Just remember to give it back to me because I don't have another one.
Plug it in right here.
Yeah.
Just leave it. It's not holding a charge.
Oh, really? Why? Why do you think that is?
Probably an old computer.
Yeah.
Time for an iPhone.